First, China, modern China, although it's autocratic, it is not essentially planned economy. There are many firms in China that are very much integrated with the world market. They don't want to be in the position of being seen as having helped Putin avoid the consequences of his aggression. They may or may not be under pressure from their own government to deal, but many will probably do. Just as so, the famous story right now is Shell, the Western oil company, purchased some Russian oil and then apologized for having done it and said it won't do it again. Obviously, there's probably going to be a substantial amount of de facto sanctions from the Chinese private sector, even though the Chinese government isn't part of it. Second, China can't replace some key imports. China can't supply replacement parts for Boeing and Airbus airplanes. It can't supply some crucial high-end semiconductors and so on down the list. Logistics are a big problem, and I'll get to that in a second. And the last part, which I do believe is very important if we try to think about how this plays out, is that Russia is not a superpower, China is. The Chinese economy is about 10 times as big as Russia's economy now. And it's very difficult for the current Russian regime to turn to China for aid without effectively becoming a Chinese client state. And that has to put some limits on well, maybe not, we don't know what people do in desperation, but it is a really big problem. It's not as if there was an equal partner that could help Russia out. There's a partner which is just so big that if Russia starts to rely a lot on the Chinese, Russia becomes effectively, instead of imperial dreams, Russia ends up becoming a vassal state. Just the logistics. People, if there's one thing that we've learned in global economics these past couple of years, it's that logistics, actually getting stuff from here to there, is a much bigger issue than we thought. It's not something that is easily dealt with. And although Russia and China are technically neighbors, the border is a very long way from almost everything in each country. The Russian economy is mostly west of the Urals. The Chinese economy is mostly near the coast. And the distances between, if you want to ship stuff long distance, you use, ocean transport, but that's not going to be a significant option. For oil and gas, use pipelines, but there are no pipelines going the whole way. Realistically, we're talking about rail lines, and I just pulled up a picture. Whoops. Here of just to something to wave at, to say that there are not that many rail lines. There are basically 3 rail lines for the that can bring stuff, and they're not seriously going to be able to handle the volume of stuff that would be required for China to replace a significant part of Russian trade. So China it's not nothing. The pressure would be a lot greater if China were part of the coalition, which of course it is not. But China is not that much of an escape valve. Western economies, the world economy, but the critical point, again, given where we are now, is what about Western economies, where actually Japan is part of the West for the democratic world. What happens here? I think of this as being 2 quite separate issues. One of them is the United States. Unfortunately, we're not entering this moment in a great situation. The U.S. economy is very strong in real terms, but we have alarmingly high inflation, which means that there's slight echoes of the 1970s when shocks to oil prices did a great deal of damage. The question, though, is, does that have to happen? And I think the answer still is no. that we know quite a lot about why the oil shocks of the 70s were so bad. And the reason they were so bad was mostly not the direct impact of higher oil prices, but the indirect response, the response of monetary policy, very sharp interest rate hikes. This seems unnecessary and unlikely this time, even though we have significant inflation. Give you some perspective. If you are not worried about inflation, you can get something that looks like this. This is, we can do this many different ways, but this is the price of gasoline in the United States. Always a political flashpoint. And it's deflated by average earnings. So to give you some sense of what is the real burden of higher gasoline prices on U.S. workers, on the U.S. public. They've shot up. This is not the first time it's shot up. It's not even the first time it's shot up in recent memory. So if you go back to the 2010, 2011, we had a substantial rise of gas prices relative to wages, actually going substantially higher than they are now in the United States, despite everything. There was a lot of rhetoric warning that this was the stagflation come again and demanding that the Federal Reserve tighten policy. The Federal Reserve wisely said, no, this is a one-time shock. And did not tighten policy, and the U.S. economic recovery from the financial crisis just continued unabated. Despite the fact that we have substantially higher inflation now than we did then, it still looks more like that situation than in the past. I'm taking a lot of comfort from the fact that measures of longer-term inflation expectations are still relatively subdued. People are expecting, both markets and individual consumers are expecting high inflation for the next year, but much less over the medium term, which suggests that people are not building expectations of inflation into their decision-making, into their expectations, which in turn means that we're not yet at much risk of a wage price spiral, which means that the central bank probably does not have to slam on the brakes. So this is probably not, we're having a Putin shock to the world economy, but probably not a Putin recession. And that makes a big difference, obviously, if that's what happens. So that's one story, and I'm relatively optimistic on that front. The other is the European issue, and this table is there just kind of as a backdrop. And that is a very specific thing. It is natural gas. Through incredible fecklessness, the Europeans and the Germans in particular allowed themselves to become highly dependent upon imports of Russian natural gas, and so far they've not been willing to sanction those. There is now a very active discussion of, well, how critical would it be if there was a drastic drop, maybe even a complete cutoff of those imports? And the answer is, it would hurt, but it's not as catastrophic as often perceived. At least that's the best we can tell. The rather surprising that with all that we're talking about here, German pre-crisis, German imports of Russian fossil fuels were less than 0.5% of German GDP. Now, what is true is that it's rather strategic. There are a lot of things where it is difficult to substitute away from natural gas. Not impossible. To some extent, Germany can replace it uses some natural gas for power generation, and it can keep coal plants running. It can stop the proposed closure of nuclear plants. That gets you some ways. There is some possibility of sourcing from abroad, although LNG from the United States and so on, we're still probably talking about the need to cut natural gas consumption by something like 30% in Germany, which is a pretty big deal. But a lot of that is for heating, and it's stuff that can be dealt with by reducing temperatures in houses a little bit, by shifting away from gas-intensive industrial production. High estimates put the loss to Germany at possibly 2% of GDP. Those do look pretty high. It's doable. Whether the political will is there, God knows. I'm no more of an expert on German political economy than anywhere else. But it's really the two points of weakness right now here, I think, would be U.S. inflation and German dependence on Russian gas, both of which should be manageable. And that's where we are. It's a awesomely very, very scary situation. Obviously, not nearly as scary. The economics is nothing like bombs, but that's where we are right now. Let me just stop it there.